So yeah, hi everyone. My name's Becca Mytton. I'm the project manager for the Stephenson Blake project at Sheffield Museums. So I'm based here at Kelham Museum. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Stephenson Blake project, which at the moment is a feasibility project. So I'll talk to you about who Stephenson Blake and company were. They're a type foundry. I'll explain what type founding is. If you're not familiar, I'll explain who the company were and their kind of history in Sheffield. And this enormous collection that they had, which ended up in London, which there is now an opportunity to bring back to Sheffield. So I'll talk to you as well about that and all the kind of work that we're doing currently to assess that feasibility. So we are in feasibility stage at the moment. I want to just make that really clear. So what that means is that we're exploring the potential of housing and displaying the collection here at Kelham Museum in a new extension. So nothing is guaranteed at this stage, basically. It all would depend on getting funding for a capital project here. And a key part of what we're doing at the moment is assessing that financial viability, because to do this would require a lot of money in what, as I'm sure you all know, is quite a challenging funding landscape for heritage. But we are kind of exploring all options and gathering as much information that we can now, so that everything's kind of in place if we are able to secure investment at a later date. So to kind of situate what I'm talking about, Stephenson Blake and Company were a type foundry. They were founded in 1818 to produce metal type for letterpress printing. And they quickly became very successful, gaining an international reputation for the highest quality design and production. And from their early history, they were based, as photographed here, on Upper Allen Street. So that's about a 10-minute walk that way. Sorry for people that can't see me, but it's on Upper Allen Street, so it's kind of on the way to the university from Kelham Island, around the kind of Scotland Street area. And that photograph is from the 1990s, and next to it is an engraving from the early 20th century. It's probably a bit embellished, as these engravings often are, but the frontage that you can see there does align with what the building currently looks like. So not all of it is still there at all, but that bit with the archway still is, and it's now a block of flats called Impact, which is the name of one of Stephenson Blake's typefaces, one of the most recognisable ones. So I'll now just quickly run through what type founding actually is before I talk to you about Stephenson Blake and Company themselves. So to do this, we need to go right. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm just saying that we're going to talk about the kind of history of type founding, what it actually is. But to do that, we need to go way back to Gutenberg in the 15th century. Movable type had been invented in East Asia in the 9th century, but it hadn't been mechanized or produced at scale, and it hadn't spread to Europe. So Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press in 1450 therefore proved revolutionary. It enabled the mass production of text for the first time and led to huge changes with regard to access to information and literacy across Europe. The process involved the use of individual pieces of metal type, set back to front and upside down into words and sentences, then lock type for printing. And the original press, as depicted here, was said to have been inspired by a grape press used for making wine. And this method of firstly casting type from molten metal and then using it for letterpress printing was used continuously for about the next 500 years with little change. And it was this method that Stephenson Blake were using when they began production in 1818. Oops, how have I skipped beyond? Sorry. Sorry about this. I don't know what happened there. Where was I? Here we go. So yes, this diagram shows the kind of key stages of making metal type for printing. Item 1 is a piece of steel, which would have a letter engraved into it, which would make a punch, which is item 2. This process of punch cutting was an extremely intricate and skilled craft, as it required carving very accurate, often very tiny letters based on paper drawing into a piece of metal. So punch cutters were very well paid for their craft, and they were kind of hard to find and hard to train. So often Stephenson Blake would go from Sheffield to Europe to find punch cutters, and pictured here is a man called Gerner from Germany. So once that punch item 2 has been made, it was struck into a piece of copper, which is item 3, and that creates a matrix, which is item 4. The matrix then goes into a hand mold, item 5. Molten metal would be poured in, and that produces a piece of type, which had to be smoothed and dressed for use by printers. So at the bottom there, you can see it comes out with an extra bit of metal on the end. That needed to be snapped off. It needed to be dressed so that it could be then packaged up and sent off to printers. And if you're interested, the metal that's used for metal type is an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony. And there is some metal type here, if anyone in the room wants to have a look afterwards, from Stephenson Blake. So these are some type founding materials from the collection. These are some type founding materials from the Stephenson Blake collection itself. So you can see, well, it's a bit. There are some punches and matrices that I just mentioned. There's a hand mold and a ladle and a box of finished type. I'll explain more about what's in the collection later, but the bulk of it is these punches and matrices, which are going to make up the DNA of the type. Oh. Sorry, had a bit of feedback in the room. And they were very carefully protected by the company. As I said, they were kind of, you needed them to make the type. If you lost them, you'd have to go back to the beginning. So they were very precious. So these are 2 quotes I like and I wanted to share because I think they really illustrate why type founding is such a unique and interesting craft, and why it's particularly suited, I think, to an organisation like Sheffield Museums for its combination of art and design with science, technology, and industry. So the casting surface of a typographical matrix is as concise an intersection of art and technology as possible. Without art, it isn't worth doing. Without technology, it can't be done at all. And in type, the appearance of beauty and elegance depends on trickery and skill, perhaps the most fruitful and long-lasting collision of science and art. So as I mentioned, the casting of type is a very time-consuming, labour-intensive process. But eventually, more efficient methods of producing foundry type were invented. So from the 1950s, Stephenson Blake introduced type casting machinery to improve efficiency. And some of those machines are pictured here. They kind of followed the same process that I showed you, but in one matrix, you could spit out lots and lots of type. The pantograph was also introduced to engrave matrices directly from a paper design. So that's what's pictured here. And all typefaces, whether they were then made on a pantograph or carved into a punch by hand, began life as a kind of idea and then a hand-drawn design by a type designer, where they prioritized legibility and uniformity. So Stephenson Blake would commission designers to create original typeface designs. I'll show you some of those in a minute. And they were particularly known for what were known as fancy designs that would be used for titling and display. That was kind of their forte, but they also produced standard body typefaces, things like Times New Roman, that would be used for newspaper and book copy. And they also bought the rights to designs from other foundries. So Times New Roman is an example of a typeface that Stephenson Blake didn't design, but they did produce in the foundry because they bought the rights to it. And also they revived various old typefaces from foundries that they'd brought up. And I'll talk more about that process of them acquiring lots of other type foundries in a moment. These photos are all from the collection, and they show the production life cycle of a Stephenson Blake typeface. This one is called Tea Chest. It was designed by Robert Harling, who was a prominent type designer. He was also randomly a good friend of Ian Fleming, and some people say the inspiration for James Bond. There's a Guardian article about it if you're interested. So the photos begin with some correspondence between Harling and staff at Stephenson Blake about the idea for this new typeface. Then there are his original paper designs, justifying proofs, which are about establishing spacing between different letters, the completed matrices, and the type itself cast there, and then the promotional material. So as I mentioned, these are 5 of Stephenson Blake's most recognizable typefaces. You might recognize them. So the first 4, Impact, Playbill, Wide Latin, and Algerian, they're all on Microsoft Office, on Word or PowerPoint. Windsor isn't on Word, but it's quite recognizable. It's been used in various kind of film and TV, as well as for lots of advertising. There's a link there, you can't see, to fontsinuse.com. I won't go on it now, but if you were interested in looking at any of these typefaces in more detail and how they've been used in print and digitally, I'd recommend having a look to see kind of where these Sheffield-made typefaces have ended up in the world. And these are some photos of pages of specimen books. Specimen books were essentially catalogues for printers to choose their typefaces, as well as kind of bordering that they might want, or little images that you can see there, which Foundry also offered. And they also produce kind of individual leaflets for specific typefaces later. And if for people in the room, there are some specimen books here, one from the 50s, one from the 20s, and various little leaflets. So do have a look if you'd like to afterwards. I'll now talk you through the company itself and how Stephenson Blake came to acquire such a large and significant collection. So as I mentioned, the company was founded in 1818. William Garnett, a silversmith and mechanic, joined forces with John Stephenson, who was known as the best filer in Sheffield. Financial support came from James Blake. So originally it was Garnett, Stephenson and Blake, or some combination of those names, but Garnett later left to become a farmer. And then the Stephenson Blake family has kind of remained in the business until the end. And in 1819, London Type Foundry went up for sale, and Garnett and Stephenson bought the business, went down to London, packed it all up and moved it back to Sheffield, which really sped up the process of them becoming a very successful type foundry, because they didn't have to make everything from scratch. They already had punches and matrices. And as I showed you earlier, it would have taken a long time to begin that whole process from scratch. So by a process of continual success, as well as various acquisitions and mergers, by 1937, Stephenson Blake had become by far the biggest type foundry in the UK and had customers all over the world. You might not be able to see this very well, but this is a kind of family tree that covers all the material in the National Type Founding Collection, of which the Stephenson Blake collection became a part in 1996. And I'll explain more about that later. But you can see Stephenson Blake here, and what this kind of shows is all the different companies that Stephenson Blake acquired over the years, and therefore they were acquiring their collections as well. So of the National Type Founding Collection, they kind of have this huge lineage of loads of different materials. So Stephenson Blake was always a family business, and the eldest Stephenson sons acted as directors for over 5 generations. I met Henry Stephenson, one of the Henry Stephensons, the last Henry Stephenson, who's in his 90s recently, who was one of the last directors of the company. Members of the Blake family also worked as directors and had other roles within the foundry throughout its history too. Pictured here are the son and grandson of John Stephenson, who co-founded the foundry. So as the firm became more successful over the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century, the Stephenson family in particular took an increasingly prominent role in Sheffield's public and political life. And this is especially true of Henry Kenyon Stephenson. He was Lord Mayor twice, he was Master Cutler, High Sheriff of Derbyshire, elected as a Liberal MP in 1918, and he was the first treasurer, and later Pro-Vice Chancellor of the University of Sheffield. And he also married a Blake daughter, so from that point, the families were kind of bound together in a familiar way as well as a kind of business way. The family's also had other business interests in the city. For example, they acquired Thomas Turton and Sons Steelworks, and Henry Kenyon Stephenson was chairman of the Sheffield Gas Company at one point. They obviously made lots of money as well, and there are some buildings you might be familiar with that they used to own. So Hassop Hall near Bakewell was in the Stephenson family, and what's now Milnhurst Prep School in Ecclesall was owned by the Blake family. They used to live there. So over the years, Stephenson Blake typed to every continent of the world. Through the mid-20th century, an increasing share of their stock was sent abroad. And this was because the UK print industry was modernising more quickly than elsewhere. So from the late 19th century, monotype and linotype were introduced. And these were methods that enabled printers to cast their own type, print with it, then melt it down and start again. So it sort of cut out the need for that middleman. And they no longer needed foundry type, just the machinery and matrices, which they could get direct from these new companies. Later on, litho and photo typesetting dominated before eventually digital printing took over. But despite all of these developments, Stephenson Blake weathered the storm through to the 1990s when they stopped producing foundry type. So they were kind of producing type for a smaller market and sending more of it abroad. But crucially, they also diversified. So they had a particularly successful woodworking department as well as an engineering department. And the woodworking department, as well as making print-related materials, would also make things like museum cabinets and stereo cases. And one of their woodworking services was to do a full fit-out of print shop. So if you were starting a print business, you could get Stephenson Blake to come. They'd set you up with all your printing machinery, all your drawers of type and all of that. And it's very likely that they did this for the Titanic, which had a print room to print daily menus and daily news. So this is a picture of a menu from the Titanic, and all the typefaces shown there are Stephenson Blake ones from Sheffield. So in its heyday, the foundry building was very big and it employed hundreds of people across a number of departments. Pictured here, you can see women working in the warehouse, and the smaller photos show an engineering room, the brass rule department, and the typecasting department. It should be noted that, like other industries in Sheffield, this was often dangerous and unpleasant work. In 1843, the type founders went on strike, and in their notice, the townspeople of Sheffield referred to the trade as unhealthy in the extreme and very destructive to life. So that was a result of some cases of lead poisoning due to the lead in the type, and also just dangerous machinery, difficult conditions. So in the end, the various departments of the company were sold off in the 1990s, and parts of the building were rented out for workshops as well. Then in 1999, Tom Blake, one of the last directors, revived the company to make hot foil type. So, you know, if you have in the spine of a book some kind of embossed gold lettering, that's hot foil printing, and they did that for a more bespoke market. And if you're interested, there are two companies currently in Sheffield that descend from the foundry. So there's Stephenson and Blake, who make brass rule and tools for plastic welding, who come from the engineering side of the business, and John Spur, who offer bespoke joinery. So I'll now talk to you about the collection itself. As I've said, the foundry was very successful and it acquired lots of other foundries that sometimes predated their own. So they amassed this enormous and very internationally significant collection. And it was kept 2 floors underground at Upper Allen Street in what they called the tomb. And as I mentioned, it was very carefully protected because it was kind of foundational to everything they did. So the collection itself dates back to the 16th century, and it contains 2.5 million handmade artifacts, mostly those punches and matrices I showed you earlier. And the reason that there are so many items is that there's a full set for every letter of every typeface and each of its different point sizes and fonts, so italics, bolds, etc. So for Windsor, you'll have all the different sizes, as well as in bold or italic, but then you also have Windsor elongated or Windsor condensed, and they had different versions of all these typefaces. So there's an enormous amount in there, and it also means that it's very heavy because it's a lot of metal. So the collection weighs just over 54 metric tons. It also contains a library, an archive of business records, designs, proofs, and advertising materials, including specimen books, as well as 8 typecasting machines from the 1850s, which will also be adding to that weight. The collection also includes a number of rare and unique items, again, that were mostly acquired from foundries that predated them. So these include Hebrew, Samaritan, Arabic and Ethiopic type used in the 17th century London Polyglot Bible, the original punches for Moxon's Irish type, which was used by the Church of Ireland for the 17th century, the matrices for Union Pearl pictured here, which is the first English decorated type. So I don't know how well you can see, but it's kind of within the letters, there's little decorations. And also the punches and matrices for the original Caslon type, which was used to print the very first copy of the American Declaration of Independence, and was also the first sans serif typeface developed in the UK. So in 1996, somehow over the course of 2 days, they managed to pack all of this up and move it to Stockwell in London. It was bought with a grant from the National Heritage Memorial Fund and taken to the Type Archive, which, as I mentioned earlier, housed past tense, the National Type Founding collection. So there had been attempts to keep the collection in Sheffield in 1993, but there wasn't really the funding for it at the time. And as I'm sure you'll know, it was a complex time for heritage in Sheffield. There was lots of industrial companies that were shutting down, had been shutting down, and their collections were all in need of a home as well. So unfortunately, that didn't come to fruition. But whilst it's a shame that the city didn't get it, it's a really good thing that the collection stayed together, because it's likely that if it weren't for that grant and it moving to the Type Archive, it would have been broken up and sold to private collectors in the US. But then in 2021, the Type Archive announced its closure. And then last year, the collection was packed up and taken into the temporary care of the Science Museum Group. So they're looking after it at the moment. It's in the National Collection Centre. And it's therefore in need of a home, and that's where this project comes in. So we were approached by the National Heritage Memorial Fund, again, who bought the collection in the first place, and the Science Museum group, to see if we could conduct a feasibility study to see if we could bring the collection back to Sheffield. The first thing we did was an options appraisal to assess different locations that the collection could go in the city, and Kellam Museum was the clear front runner due to its industrial focus, its proximity to the foundry building, and the fact that we have got space on site here for development. Because there isn't space in the museum currently, but again, subject to the right investment, there is potential for a capital project to build an extension to the rear of the island that way. So there's a building that we currently use for storage, it's an old factory building. That could be demolished and an extension built in its place that would house the existing collection, as well as the Stephenson Blake collection. So as well as the extension and the housing of the collection, it would also be an opportunity for us to do other work at the museum. So it would also enable us to have new facilities and activity spaces and a new entrance at the museum. So as well as those architectural plans and thinking about how we might physically be able to accommodate the collection, we also looked at exhibition design and how we'd activate it, and also business planning to think about how we can make this site more financially sustainable if we are able to get money to put into it. So what we've kind of ultimately found is that this project would be a good thing for the museum, and we think it would be a good thing for Sheffield. But yeah, it will depend on getting funding for it at some point in the future. So this is a sketch of what it might look like. These are feasibility study level plans. So none of this is set in stone at all. It could all change in a kind of design and development process. But you can kind of see there. So, well, a good marker there is the Bessemer converter. There would be a new entrance behind that, and a new extension towards the rear of the island. And to accompany the feasibility study, as part of the feasibility study, we've also conducted a period of public consultation, which has just ended. And we've had exactly 700 survey responses that were both submitted in person and online. We're still to kind of go over the findings in detail, but it's been overwhelmingly positive. This graph was created when we'd only had 568 responses, but you can see that 98% of people responded either definitely or maybe to the question of whether they'd be encouraged to visit Kellam Museum again, or for the first time via display on Sheffield's print and design heritage. And these are just some quotes from people who filled out the survey online. And responses like this are really heartening because we can see that people are seeing the same potential in this collection that we do. Many of the responses have come via stalls at our sites. We've had little pop-up stalls here at Millennium Gallery and at Western Park Museum, and in other locations in the city like the Moore Market and Pollen Market. And generally you find that people haven't heard of Stephenson Blake, which isn't surprising. But if you then show them some familiar typefaces and tell the story of their Sheffield origin, this kind of sparks an interest and people are interested in learning more. And the kind of comments here show some of that. So someone talking about being both a font geek and interested in Sheffield's history, and it's therefore being a dream for them. Someone kind of noting how it connects to the city's new industries as well as its heritage, and then someone noting its kind of educational potential, which we think would be an enormous part of this. So finally, I want to kind of elaborate on that potential and those opportunities we see in the collection with some photos from another museum. So this is Typoteca in Italy, which I and other colleagues have been very fortunate enough to visit. There isn't currently a dedicated print or type museum in the UK. There's kind of print and type are included in other stories, but they aren't looked at in detail. So this collection would provide us an opportunity to do something new on a national level. Typoteca is just north of Venice, and it's a small and very well designed, very beautiful museum. And as well as functioning as a traditional museum with some permanent displays and temporary exhibitions, it hosts a significant workshop program, especially for schools. I think they see thousands and thousands of school children through the door every year. And as you can see here, they do print workshops with them and demonstrations. And they also have a kind of working printing there, as well as a library and event spaces. So we think that with this collection, we could potentially offer something similar, not a kind of static museum space, but a very active display that tells a wider story of design and communication, as well as offering workshops, demonstrations, research opportunities, and versatile, inspiring spaces. So we are hopeful that at some point we can make this happen, but we're also realistic about the kind of difficult funding context we find ourselves in. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, I can answer them now, or feel free to email me afterwards.